All right, so resuming our recording here, welcome to our program this evening. Let's talk about some tomatoes. This is the time of year when we're really thinking about them a lot. Most of you are either starting to or have already gotten them into the ground. We've gotten a few of our tomatoes into the ground. So far, we're actually doing tomatoes from seed this year and not from starts, so we'll see how that goes. But there tends to be a lot of questions on the best ways to grow these and how to handle a lot of the disease issues that we get with tomatoes. In Indiana, we have a lot of diseases and a lot of insects that are going to be attacking our tomatoes, and it can be a challenge to try to handle them. So why don't we just get started here with some information on tomatoes. So tomatoes are a plant that is native to this hemisphere. They are originally found in areas like Peru and Chile, and their original variety looks significantly different from what we grow today. They were much smaller, they varied a lot more in color. There used to be, and still is, a variety that's actually referred to as golden apple. Some people think it may not necessarily be great for consumption, but a lot of people will swear by them. It really depends on your personal preference. But this really illustrates that we have taken the tomato plant and we have really changed it to suit our needs. It's a great example of a crop that we definitely thoroughly domesticated for our purposes and in so many different ways. So tomatoes do belong to the nightshade family of plants. This is actually really interesting to me. This is someone who's worked in biology. If you look at the different groupings of plants that are within the nightshade family, you can find basically all kinds of different things that bear no resemblance to each other. And let's face it, when you look at a potato versus a tomato, you're not going to find a lot of similarities there. But they are all a part of the same grouping. It's just there's a lot of variety within that particular family. Originally, tomatoes were believed to be potentially poisonous even. There's a legend that you can look up that Amy notes here of someone back in 1830 who ate the first tomato ever in North America. And he was warned that if he ate it, his blood would turn to acid. And he proved that they were safe by eating one in public in his town in front of everybody and claimed it was delicious. Now, tomatoes didn't actually come into real growing practice in the United States until the 19th century. So there's been a little bit of time since then. So I believe the 1830 legend is probably just a legend, but it does kind of show it took a while to really start with tomatoes here in this country. So when we talk about growing tomatoes, we are talking about two different types of tomatoes. And oftentimes those types of tomatoes can differ between your plans for them. So we have our two primary types, determinate and indeterminate. So if you grow big, bushy tomatoes that all put out their tomatoes and flowers all at once, that is a determinate type. It's a bush. A lot of you are probably familiar, though, with our indeterminate type. These are our vining types of tomatoes. They're going to be continuing to put out tomatoes throughout the season. So, for example, if you want to do a lot of canning and want to get it all done all at once, a determinate type is probably something that you're aiming for. It's going to put out all of its fruit all at once. However, if you just want fresh tomatoes and different flavors of them throughout the season, then the indeterminate type is what you're actually looking for there. So a lot of these tomatoes that we're going to be talking about are going to be the results of hybridization. Hybrids and heirlooms are two different things, and this is actually really important when you're considering growing tomatoes. Hybrids are the results of a controlled cross-pollination. This means that you or someone you bought them from cross-pollinated them to be able to favor particular traits within the plants. Disease resistance is probably the most common thing that most plants are hybridized for. However, you could also hybridize plants for the sake of getting them to survive an environment a little bit better. Like if you want tomatoes that are going to survive our hardiness zone a little bit better. Or if you want tomatoes that are going to be more productive within certain areas. These are the things that you're going to hybridize plants for. But the thing to keep in mind is that if you choose to get a hybrid variety or create one on your own, you're probably not going to save the seed from the F1. When you hybridize, whether it's animals or plants, oftentimes the offspring of that hybrid just isn't viable. And in the case of tomatoes, it just means it's not going to produce as much if it produces anything at all. So go ahead, grow your hybrids, but plan on getting new seed or new starts next season, because most likely they aren't going to be creating usable seed after that point. Heirlooms, however, are totally different. This is a line of tomatoes that has been created and kept for a particular purpose. These are grandma and grandpa's favorite tomatoes that you love so much and you want to keep going and make sure that your children have the opportunity to grow these. These can be openly pollinated through insects, wind, or other natural mechanisms. Oftentimes they are pollinated in a very controlled manner just to make sure that they don't hybridize. And we typically refer to something as an heirloom species if it has been kept for 50 years and preserved for that amount of time, and it has a particular flavor, it has particular features that match to a region. So if you went from county to county, you would probably find a few different heirlooms in each county here in Indiana. And oftentimes they're probably connected to individual families or individual growing operations. Even my grandmother had her own preferred heirloom variety that she grew. So it's very, very common to have these. The trouble is that when you have an heirloom variety, you're favoring for flavor, you're favoring for size. So most likely you aren't getting traits that mean that you're going to have good characteristics when it comes to storage or when it comes to disease and pest resistance. So your heirlooms tend to be a little bit more susceptible to all of these problems. That doesn't mean don't grow them. You absolutely want to grow them for their flavors and other things, but you have to be aware of what you're getting into as you start to grow them. Okay, so one of the more important things about tomatoes right now is going to be when do you want to get them into the ground and when is that season going to end? And typically for all plants, we're talking about the point at which the last frost occurs to the point at which the first frost occurs. Now, spot of good news, I believe we just hit our last frost date. So in theory, barring a unique weather event, we should be okay for the rest of the season. I would take this with a little bit of salt because if you recall last year, we did get an awful late cold snap that produced frost. So keep an eye on your calendars, keep an eye on your weather reports. And if nothing else, contact your local extension office. These are things that we pay attention to. Most likely we're going to see our our first frost occurring sometime in mid to late October. I believe last year, first frost was around October 9th. So you're going to want to pay attention to that as we get closer to the end of the season. These plants do not do well once those frosts occur though. They're going to lose their leaf tissue and you won't be getting any more fruit out of them. So keep that in mind. One question that I get very, very often is where to put your tomatoes. So tomatoes have a few requirements to them. These are full sun plants and they do need well-drained soil. So those are a combination of two things that in my area isn't really that hard to find. I live and work in two different valleys where there's a lot of hilly areas. So that means that we have a lot of good options for planting tomatoes, but you do need to make sure that you keep them away from other plants to a certain degree. Tomatoes have pretty good nutrient requirements, and you don't want to put them near trees or shrubs who have even greater and more greedy nutrient requirements who will steal that stuff right out of the soil for themselves. They need relatively level areas. Remember, these plants, they can get leggy, they can get viney, so you're going to want good stable positioning for them so you can put out your cages and have those work well. You're also going to want to avoid any soil that has been previously contaminated. What I mean by that is that if there's been a pathogen occurring in that soil, a disease, it's not a good idea to plant there. Even the most resistant tomatoes will get disease pretty readily. So I would not plant anything in soil that you've had issues with before. And Amy adds here that plant them close to a source of water. Now, this is not only just to make sure that the tomatoes are adequately supplied, but it makes it easier on you. I don't know about you guys, but my back tends to hurt these days. I do not want to go very far when I water my plants outside, when I get to my roses, my other things. So I like to keep my water source close. So keep that in mind as you begin to plan out where to put your tomatoes. Right now, a lot of you are probably just growing your starts in pots and in pans still. So before you move these outside all the way, and once they've gotten fully hardened, take a look around. Think about where you're going to put these before you make that decision. Okay, so the other argument that I often get is, Bob, is there a good reason to plant seeds, or is there a good reason to plant starts or transplants? Well, there are good reasons for both of these. You get different benefits. Looking at myself. You get different benefits out of either one. If you plant from seeds, like we're trying out this year, that means that you get your choice. You can choose what kind, what flavor, what varieties, potentially what resistances are going to be in your tomatoes. But that means that you're going to have to deal with the process of growing these from seed and getting them hardened to be able to go outside well enough. Starts, however, probably have already gotten a beneficial start if you get them from a reputable source. They're going to be a little bit stouter. They're not going to be leggy as much. They may have some hardening already so they can go outside a little bit quicker. But that means that you may be limited in the choices you have open to you. Starts you're going to be getting from local stores. You're going to be getting them from local herb markets that spring up here and there. So that really does limit what you can put in the ground. And the other thing that I would say too is with either one of these choices, you want to make sure the source you're getting them from. Just because you go to like an open air herb market, you see some great tomato starts. If you don't know the grower and you don't know what they've done, you're not sure what you're going to get out of this. There are a lot of questions there. So I would double check who I'm choosing to work with when I buy my plants. Now, when you select your cultivars, there are a lot of different ways that you can go about this. There are as many ways to get tomatoes as you can think of under the sun. There are plenty of mail order catalogs, different stores out there that you can find these things in. You can probably also get them from potentially extension bulletins. Purdue doesn't necessarily sell tomato seeds, but other schools and other offices might as well. So there are lots of different ways to get your seeds. So what I would say again is you just need to make sure that who you're buying them from is reputable. And also keep in mind that if you're getting seeds out of an heirloom variety, you got to make sure that that variety can survive the environment that you put them in. Okay, so there's some information on these seed packages or on your starts that you guys should really be aware of. Especially if you've had disease issues in the past. So these are the disease resistance codes that you will find on packages of seeds and potentially on the tags on starts. So I'll just go through them one by one here. So our V is our Verticillium Wilt. F is going to be our Fusarium Wilt, and also the number of Fs will indicate which races of Fusarium it's resistant against. The 3 Fs there being races 1, 2, and 3. N is going to stand for nematodes, which are a type of near microscopic worm. You can actually see some of them with the naked eye, but they can cause all kinds of different disease and other issues in roots. A is our alternaria, which is extraordinarily common in garden plants, especially tomatoes. T is tobacco mosaic virus. ST is stem phyllium, or our gray leaf spot. And TSWV is our tomato spotted wilt virus. So all of these will be on different packages that you get tomatoes from. And this is one of the ways that I personally check to see if these seeds are ones that I want to buy, because if they're not telling me what's on there, they're either an heirloom variety or maybe these weren't packaged the best. So here's an example of it. These are all from the same provider here, the same producer. So you can see on their celebrity hybrid tomato, if you look a little bit further under that title, you're going to see VFNTMV. So it's telling you there it's got Verticillium, Fusarium, nematode, and tobacco mosaic virus resistance. And then if you look all the way onto the right, you can see the Cherokee purple is an heirloom tomato, and it's saying it's indeterminate, but it doesn't list disease resistance. This is because it's an heirloom. This wasn't hybridized for disease resistance, and they can't be sure what resistances this plant has without some research being done. So they're just simply not putting it on the labeling. This is one of those points where, yeah, that's okay, because this is an heirloom. They're telling you it's an heirloom, so don't panic if you don't see it. Just make sure that you look at the labeling to make sure what is on there. And this is nice because it provides that benefit of having a few things to compare it against, so you know that, yes, they do have those hybrids. They are working on making sure you know what you're getting. So let's talk a little bit about our transplant quality. Normally, a lot of problems I see with people starting tomatoes is they'll get some starts and they're going to be leggy. They're going to be spindly. They're not going to look good. What you want are transplants that have this nice, stout, bushy appearance. These plants are going to get the best possible start when you put them in the soil, and they're not going to grow all over the place and look kind of crazy. They have already been started. They probably have a little bit of hardening behind them already. They've got good reach to sun. These plants here, they're being started in their individual pans, and you can see that these are getting a little bit tall because they're all fighting for sunlight with each other. So at this point, whoever is growing these tomatoes, I would start moving these to spread them out so that way they're not fighting for the sun quite as much. Keep in mind that as you get your transplants and you get them in your home, the problem you're going to run into is that the light coming in your window probably isn't going to be sufficient to prevent them from getting that spindly appearance. So you need to either provide some artificial lighting in your house, or you need to do something where you're moving them from the outside to the inside on kind of a daily basis, because that'll help them harden a little bit, and it'll get them that extra dose of pure sunlight to help them get enough sun and not get super spindly before you move them outside. Now, what my wife and I did this year with our tomatoes is she started them. They started showing signs that they needed some more sun. So what she did is she moved them outside kind of early to let them harden, and we're going to see how that works out. We're hoping it works with the piece of ground we've chosen for them, but it'll be a little bit of an experiment to see how well they harden. Right now, I have good hopes for them because the weather hasn't chilled too much since she moved them. So a little bit on soil preparation. You're going to want to make sure that you choose a really good patch of ground for this. You want, like I said earlier, you're going to want to make sure it's level. You're going to need a spot with full sun. It's also going to need to be a spot that's going to get a decent amount of nutrients. You may consider adding nutrients to your soil to help support those plants. You're also going to want to make sure that you do a good tilling of the soil there to break up any potential weeds and hopefully destroy seed banks of weeds that could be present. I know that if you till, you're kind of breaking up your soil structure, but a lot of the good spots to put tomatoes into the ground are going to be the same ones that tend to compact because people have grown on them over and over. So I would just go ahead and till them to get rid of that compaction, so that way your tomatoes have a better chance of getting their roots in there and getting a sturdy grip. You're also going to want to consider adding in not just maybe normal fertilizer, but consider adding in some organic matter and mulches to help provide a little extra to you, so that way they can have a good supply of nutrients to get started with. One thing that I also get asked a lot about, are there any herbicides I can use near tomatoes? And in short, the answer is no. There really aren't going to be any herbicides that are going to work great around tomatoes, because most likely where you're planting them, you're putting them in your garden. And you have a lot of different plants there that could get impacted by herbicide use. And folks, I'll tell you right now, herbicides don't have friends. They are going to affect what they're going to affect. That's what their job is. So when it comes to getting rid of weeds, you are going to be better off doing it mechanically. This means that you're going to have to put in some time, use if you have younger weeds, you can manually pull them out of the ground yourself, like I've been enjoying for the last several days, because I have so many dandelions popping up in my areas. You can also consider using different kinds of mulch or plastics to help protect your plants, as well as some hoeing to try to dig out the more adult weeds. If the weeds are bigger, like they're not as young anymore, I wouldn't try to hand pull them, because at that point you may just rip off the top, but the roots are still there and they could still continue to develop and get some above ground growth again. Those you're probably going to be hoeing out of the ground or using some other kind of tool. If you can get some black plastic mulch, that's going to help your tomatoes develop a little bit better. It's going to provide some more warmth to the soil, and increasing that temperature is just going to help those grow a little bit better. Now, the thing is that as you increase your soil temperatures, you are increasing those temperatures for the weeds as well. So when you put your mulch, your plastic mulch down, make sure that it is not clear. If it is clear, that means you're providing sunshine to all of the plants, all the weeds that could develop underneath the mulch. So you don't want that to happen. Make sure that mulch is not clear. That's why I typically say use a black plastic mulch. That is going to save you a lot of heartache, and it's going to help get that soil warmed up nice and early, help your tomatoes develop. There are a few different mulch materials you might consider as well. Leaves, straw, those kinds of things work. We use leaves because in the area that I work in, or I live in, we have a lot of trees, and we just get a ton of leaves falling on our yard every year. So we put those to good use. We actually use those around not only the tomatoes, but the herbs that we've been developing. So far, I've noticed that my sage has really benefited from leaf mulch. I didn't think the sage was going to survive the winter. We didn't even cover it over the course of the winter, and I thought it was going to die. And now that we've got it covered with leaf mulch, it has just gone gangbusters. It is blooming, it is huge. So I can tell you from experience that that might be an option you might want to consider, and just along with the plastic, of course, that I was talking about just a moment ago. All right, when it comes to tomatoes, one thing that you should do is you need to go vertical. Even if they're bushy, a cage is going to help support that plant, because let's face it, when we get the fruit of these plants, that fruit is heavy. It's going to put a lot of stress on the vines and on the branches, so it's going to be pulling them down, so they're going to need support. And these two images really sum it up really well. The cage is helping support the plant there that's growing and supporting all those fruit, and then you can see the illustration of tying the vine to the stake so it can develop and the suckers can go around that stake, and they can just hold themselves up really well doing that. So another thing to consider here, let me go back to the previous slide. Another question that we often get is, should I prune my tomatoes? And if you look at the bushier plant here, you'll look at that and you're kind of maybe thinking, man, that plant is just going everywhere. And you may ask yourself if you want to prune. The answer that we've come up with so far is that essentially there is no answer. People who are against pruning are going to say you're damaging the plant and you're potentially introducing disease to a healthy growing plant. People who are for pruning are going to want to make sure that they can shape the plant and direct the energy the plant has to where it's going to be bearing fruit and creating flowers, as opposed to just creating more and more branches to separate off of that plant. The only thing that I'm going to say is, if you want your plant to continue to grow upwards, you want to avoid cutting the growing tips. If you don't want them to, then severing the growing tip will help control some of that growth. But ultimately, I would leave the choice of pruning up to you guys. Contact your extension educator locally. If you're considering this, you just need more answers to it, because personally, I think this is more of a case-by-case basis when it comes to pruning tomatoes. Okay, so the real crux of this evening's conversation is going to be our common tomato problems. And I don't know how many of you attended my talk earlier this week on cucurbits, but I mentioned at that talk that there are a lot of shared diseases with tomatoes. Tomatoes are by far the most common garden plant grown in Indiana, and that means that they are probably sharing a lot of those diseases with a lot of different plants. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ultimate vector for it, but they are going to be the most common point of intersection with a lot of them. So let's get started with blossom end rot. So this one is interesting to me because I got to learn something this week. So I originally thought that blossom end rot was originally caused by a calcium deficiency in the soil. But Amy, the educator who created this, actually pointed out to me, and she sent me some great research that showed it's not necessarily a calcium deficiency, but rather a water deficiency that prevents calcium from reaching the entirety of the plant. So what it is that you have a plant that may not be getting enough water because soil normally has enough calcium. Now, there are instances where soil may not have enough calcium, especially if you live in areas where strip mining has been done, or areas that have had different environmental events. So you might want to consider getting a soil test done on the area of blossom end rot is something you normally run into. However, the most common issue is going to be, is the soil drying out too much in between time? So what I would do is check how much water the plants are getting, push your finger into the soil to see how moist the soil is staying in between waterings, and then maybe consider mulch to help the roots stay moist. Now, I will add to this too, is that if you have problems with blossom end rot, this is one that occurs on other plants as well. You'll see it on squash and a variety of things like eggplant and other plants. So it's not just limited to tomatoes. All right, Verticillium Wilt, this is another common one that we find in tomatoes. You're going to see plants that are wilting. You'll see yellowing in the lower portion of the plant first, and you're going to see, if you cut the stem, a browning inside of the stem. Those are all signs of Verticillium Wilt in action. And this ultimately means that the plant is losing potentially its vascular system. It's not going to be able to transport water as well. And it means that it's losing photosynthetic area. So it's just not getting enough to eat. Fusarium wilt is another great example of issues that we find in tomatoes. The wilt will occur typically on one side of the plant. You're going to see the leaves cure or turn bright yellow. But unlike verticillium, the pith and the stem will remain healthy. So if you cut the stem, it's still going to be that clear, healthy color. Early blight, this is Alternaria. This is one that I actually talked about earlier this week that you can find on squash and other plants. Alternaria is a leaf spotting disease or early blight. You'll find leaf spotting occurring. You can see the picture here showing the plant's got a lot of leaf loss in the lower portions, starting to head up into the upper portions. You know that you're looking at Alternaria because the spots there kind of have that yellowish ring around the spot. You can see these kinds of concentric brown rings within the spot itself. That's just very telltale. And you can find that hosts for this plant are tomato and potato. Ideally, you want to rotate crops out every 2 to 3 years if you have Alternaria developing. Septoria Bilght is another very common issue. This is one of the more common ones that I run into. Septoria also has pretty telltale spots on it. If you look at the leaves there in the image, you can see a darker ring of tissue surrounding a lighter one that's making a kind of bullseye appearance. And you can see that there's a yellowing surrounding that. And in the other image, you can see that there's a lot of leaf loss towards the lower portion of the plant. And again, crop rotation is going to be important to prevent having this reoccur within your tomatoes. So one thing that I will add before I jump into the bacterial bits here is that all of the ones that we just discussed are all fungal diseases. So these are caused by spores, different fungi that are traveling between plants. These are good reasons why you want to make sure that your plants are spread out and you don't keep reusing soil that has been infested with them before. So if you've got one of the fungal diseases, move those plants away from that area of the soil and let it rest for a few years before you replant in it, because those spores can last and they will just simply reinfect new plants. I will also add that you notice the leaf loss in the previous images. Don't let leaves from diseased plants stay on the ground. Clear them off the ground, get rid of them, because they will act as a disease vector and they will just put it back into your soil and they'll put it back into your plant. So sanitation is going to be really important there. Bacterial spot is another very, very common one that's not just limited to tomatoes. You could see what the spots look like here, kind of browning, where the plant goes through kind of a hypernecrotic reaction as it tries to kill off the diseased areas. But this is caused by bacteria. Oftentimes you could tell that you have a bacterial disease within your plants because if you cut one portion of the plant and then touch the cut portion to the spot where you cut it, kind of poke them together and pull them apart, you may see a kind of gummy substance spread between the two cut ends. That's where that bacteria is active. That's a sign of its presence, and that means that there's probably a bacterial disease at work. Unfortunately, bacterial spot is not limited to leaves, unlike our other diseases. It will go onto the fruit, and you can see the results pretty clearly right here. Unfortunately, the fruit probably aren't very recoverable at this stage. There are several different leaf spotting diseases. Some of them can be caused by viruses, which we're going to talk a little bit about some viruses here in just a moment. Zipper scarring is an instance where there is a portion of the actual blossom that remained attached to the fruit as it was developing. So you can see here the calyx of the flower remained attached to the fruit as it was developing. Unfortunately, zipper scarring can often open up the fruit. And Amy describes here a little bit that they did an experiment whether it was a better idea to leave the calyx on or to remove it. Most gardeners are going to say, go ahead and remove it. Amy found that she didn't have a whole lot of trouble when she left the calyx on. It just meant that she would have to peel the tomato pretty well. However, there were other places where other researchers found that leaving the calyx on actually opened up the fruit much faster. So you're going to have to make the decision there on whether or not you want to leave it there. Normally, this is caused by the fruit taking on a lot of water very quickly and developing very quickly and kind of swelling up before it's fully developed that way. Fruit cracking is also another instance where the fruit's kind of growing beyond its capacity, or taking on water beyond its capacity to grow. And you can see here what happens during fruit cracking. It'll just start to split the various sutures along the fruit's lines. And it just looks ugly and it doesn't make for any kind of good edible fruit for you to eat. Sunscald is one where there's usually an issue where the plant is getting a little too much sun, or at least the fruit are. So this is one of those moments where you have to ask yourself if pruning is really something you want to do here. You want to make sure that while the leaves get plenty of sun, you don't want the fruit to bake out in the sun itself, because it will get scalded and they will get damaged. So make sure that the fruit have plenty of shade that they can work with. Cat facing is another major issue that you find within tomatoes. Cat facing has different causes. It can be disease-based or it can be insect-based. And what it usually results in is the fruit is getting misshapen along suture lines where the cat facing has occurred there. So you'll want to monitor those tomatoes as they grow. Most plants, when they get cat-faced, or when the fruit get cat-faced, they're actually edible and you can keep them. But unfortunately with tomatoes, that is simply not what's going to be the experience there. Deformed foliage. This one is not necessarily caused by the things that most people think they are. This is usually due to a disease. Now, it can be caused by a lack of water or a lack of nutrients. So that's something you are definitely going to want to pay attention to. However, there are several diseases within tomatoes, namely viruses, that can cause this kind of deformation of the foliage itself. Wilting here, I'm not entirely sure why this slide was added in. Wilting can be caused primarily whether it's due to a lack of water, and there are also several different diseases that can be responsible for different wilts. Leaf roll, however, is definitely very much a viral instance. So a lot of people get really worried when leaf wilt occurs in their tomatoes. One thing I will say is that you know that you have leaf rolling occurring because the leaves will take on this kind of cigar shape and they'll roll up like this. However, this does not doom the plant. There are plenty of tomato species that are going to be just fine with some leaf rolling. That is not going to be something you need to be terribly concerned about. It's when it happens over too much of the surface area of the plant. If you get too much leaf rolling, that means you're losing photosynthetic area, or it's just not being as effective, and then you may begin to lose some of your potential crop out of that plant. So on to our bug predator, or bug herbivores, and this is my favorite portion of it because I'm an entomologist. Tomato hornworm is considered by gardeners to be one of the nastier things they find on their tomatoes. However, when it comes down to it, tomato hornworms just aren't as damaging as most people think they are when it comes to tomatoes. Tomato hornworms are primarily going after the leaves of tomatoes. They can go after the fruit, though they typically most commonly are going to be going after the leaf surfaces. And they usually don't occur in so many numbers that I would say I would be super concerned about. Most of the time, you can just pick these off by hand and put them in a bucket of soapy water, and you're probably good. Here you can actually see an image where one of the natural enemies of tomato hornworms have been at work. The white things you see on the back of this worm right here are actually the eggs laid by a particular fly. And when those eggs hatch, the larva of the fly will actually consume that hornworm and get it off your tomatoes. It'll just look real ugly when it happens. I would be real hesitant to spray these with any kind of pesticide. I would just as soon pick them off myself. I don't consider these that serious a threat to tomatoes. Stink bugs, however, these are a major problem within tomatoes. The good thing about stink bugs is they're easy to identify and they're easy to find their eggs. That if you look down at the bottom left-hand image there, The one labeled A are the eggs of the stink bug, and you can often find them attached to the undersides of leaves. And you could fairly easily just scrape these right off without damaging the leaf too badly, and you can remove the stink bugs by hand. The bigger problem comes in is when they feed on the fruit. You'll notice that yellow spotting, and then where the skin burst open, that's another example of cat facing. And that is very telltale of stink bug presence. You can even see how badly deformed the fruit is in one of those images there. I consider stink bugs a much worse problem in tomatoes than the hornworm is. All right, another thing to consider, and this is the bane of my existence where I live. If I could just get rid of every squirrel in a 4-block radius, I would be so happy because they go after my tomatoes every year. Squirrels, raccoons, and other animals are going to go right after your tomatoes. They will dig them right out of the ground, and they will eat the fruit no matter how green they are. So you may consider, if you want to get rid of them, some trapping. Depending on the area you live in, you want to make sure that you don't necessarily need a license to be able to handle that kind of wildlife on your property. So I would just double check with your local extension agent before you make a decision on how to remove any potential wildlife that threatens your garden plants. All right, there are a few things that Amy recommends here. So we do have the Purdue Tomato Doctor. I need to double check to make sure that that website is actually still active, but it's intended to help diagnose tomato issues by experts. And for this one, I would just contact your local extension educator to see what they can do. Oftentimes, we extension educators can diagnose it ourselves without a whole lot of issues, as long as you send us a picture or bring something into us. We have a lot of publications when it comes to helping tomatoes develop. This is just one of many of them. I've read this one several times myself. And this is, Iowa State is another excellent resource for these. I actually went to Iowa State as a grad student. I know some of the people who wrote these and saw some of their research on it. And of course, we have our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. This is where you can send in disease samples and fruit samples to the lab to actually get it tested. And they will actually plate disease material so that way they can accurately identify what disease is going on. If you go to their website, you can there are very clear instructions there on where to send samples and how to do so. And if you can't figure it out on your own, please feel free to contact us anytime. We're more than happy to help you with it. All right, so thank you for paying attention to our program this evening. I hope you guys picked up something out of it. If you have questions, I'd be more than happy to take them now. Feel free to unmute if you want. I will go ahead and stop our recording.